thank you very much for coming to this wonderful occasion to celebrate Arien Mack's long tenure at the new school. I think the best place to begin is with our president of the university, Joe Towers, who has also been around for a very long time, but Arien, I'm sure, beats all of us. So, but he's now president, but you know, I won't continue. So I would like to introduce Joel with the initial remarks.
The first thing you learn, Bill, is don't try to compete with Arien.
I never do.
So thank you for having me give a few introductory remarks to tonight's honor to Arien Mack. It's true, I think I know Arien. I'm only here for the last third of the time that Arien has been at the new school, and I've been here over 20 years, so that tells you something. Many of you know me to be a real avid buff of the history of the new school. I think it is critical that we understand our history, and there are very few among us who are able to help navigate the twists and turns of this institution in the way that Arien has. She has been a critical bridge for us for many, many years with who the new school is, what our history is, and how we constantly transform it to be relevant to the times in which we're living. She was originally hired by the graduate faculty of political science as an assistant professor of psychology in 1966, which is just fantastic. And really, in a lot of ways, provided that fundamental bridge to the scholars who formed the university in exile. It was actually at the encouragement of Hannah Arendt. We like to talk about Hannah Arendt, but Arien can actually speak to the person. And it was at Arendt's recommendation and encouragement that Arien took on the editorship of Social Research in 1970, a role that she has held uninterruptedly for 54 years. And her leadership has helped to shape the intellectual discussions at the new school in a world of in the world of social science for decades on topics ranging from the plague to privacy to fairness to fear to disasters and to climate change. One recurring topic that has been on her focus is the state of higher education today, or a state of higher education, aptly for our conversation this evening, the Embattled University of today. Arien always knows how to be on topic. I will tell you, and it's often the case, if I can just digress from my prepared remarks for a moment, that we're often, all of us who've had the pleasure of working with Arien, seeing things through our own disciplinary lenses. I've worked on at least 3 issues with Arien over the years focused on climate change. And it was actually one of the first things that I did when I got here in 2004. We were working on an issue on disasters and what they meant, and what was meant by calling something even that. And of course, we're living in a time that feels very much like a profound disaster. And the preparedness necessary to be able to understand, to think about what's going on and how we write about it, how we understand it, and how we use that knowledge to make change in the world. And when I think about Arien and I put it through that lens, you know, we're often thinking about both the adaptation and the mitigation of a situation. And Arien has, in her work here at the New School, engaged with both of those. The idea that the institution itself must adapt, must be responsive to the challenges of the time, and at the same moment, in the same instance, to be thinking about the long term, to mitigate the threats and the challenges to the institution itself. And being able to sort of occupy both of these spaces has been one of the really brilliant characteristics of her work over time. And you know, the scholar Mark Wigley, the architectural historian and scholar Mark Wigley, likes to say that the drawing of the city, and those of you who know me, I'm an architect, right? So I'm constantly drawing. And the drawing of the city is the section, meaning the cut through both buildings and the landscape, which is an unusual thing to think about cities. People typically think of them in plan form to understand. And what Mark gets at in that is that there are layers upon layers of the city that are revealed through the section drawing that you don't see in the plan. It's kind of a palimpsest. And Arien once told me I could only use that word once in an essay, because she had asked me to write a piece and I used it twice. And she said, you're not allowed to say palimpsest more than once. So I've now used it twice in this comment. But what the beauty of that word, because it really describes the work that Arien does, is that it is a drawing in which history is not erased, but is built upon. And I was thinking about the fact that we are in a building, and if you imagined the section of this building today, and you didn't erase the past, you would see the old GF building, because we're sitting in it right now. And for those who remember it, there would be the crisscrossed escalators, only one of which would be working. Usually the down one, which was a pain in the ass. And Wolf Conference Room would be up, and Arien's office would be up there. And, but it wouldn't just be the old GF building, because the history of New York, you would also be remembering that it was Elaine's department store. And you would be seeing the transformation of space over time, the occupation of a building by this new entity, and the history being both remembered and engaged. And when I think about Arien's work here at the New School, I think about, I will say it a third time, that palimpsest, that drawing of a place that does not forget its own history, but is making its future at the same time. And it's really such a brilliant gift that she gives to us and has for so many years. And so to be president of an institution, which, by the way, very strange thing right now, right, Ira? But a beautiful opportunity to honor those who make the institution. And it is my great friend and privilege to be able to thank you, Arien, on behalf of the New School for all that you do.
Joel, thanks. And now I feel like, stop. The organization this afternoon will be first, we will have a few people talk on contributions that Arien has made to psychology. I will do that, and Steve Pinker will do that. And then follow that, we will have her contributions to issues around endangered scholars, and both our dean, Aleinikoff, will do that, and Ahmed Bawa will do that. Then we will have a panel which is based on a upcoming issue in social research on the Embattled University. When probably it was planned a year and a half ago, it didn't seem as embattled as it does nowadays, but it seems ever more appropriate. And so I think the best way to proceed is to proceed, and now I have to figure out how to proceed. But somebody knows how to do that.
You got it.
Yeah. Okay. Being a psychologist, I appear to be the only one with PowerPoints. And I want to talk about an aspect of Arien Mack that I think many people don't fully appreciate. And that is that Arien is not only someone who has edited a journal for a long time with incredible excellence, and also has really worked in various ways through the Journal Donation Project and through various forms in which she has been concerned about embattled scholars. She's done all that, but she also is really a leading figure in psychology. If there was one word that I had to use to describe Arien, it would be astonishment, because I am astonished that anyone can do so many things, even in the long life in which she has had. And I would like to share one aspect of that astonishment, which I have to confess, I am now going to bore you with little graphs, and I can't help it. I'm a psychologist. I love numbers. So I'm going to walk you through what I think is a tutorial about what why Arien is such a leading figure in the psychology of perception. And she is indeed, I had the wrong date, it's 1966 rather than 1970. She joined the Department of Psychology, and since then she has published over 60 academic articles on perception, and she's best known for her work on inattentional blindness. And she summarized this work in a book by Irv Rock, and it has been cited 3,931 times. For those people that don't care about citation metrics, it's a big number. The issue that she wants to address in this book is, what role does attention play in perception? What is processed without attention? Here, we're really concerned, in my mind, with selective attention. That is focusing on one object in a visual array, or focusing on a specific location in a visual array. And before Arien began to explore this, I think the general notion was that perception can occur outside of attention. And there's a lot of reasons to think this. Probably the most accessible way to talk about it is through the visual search task. Here, you're simply asked, is there a red X in the array? And people will say yes. It will take them no time at all to say yes. It just pops right out. And it doesn't matter how much other stuff is cluttering the picture or not. You don't have to focus on one location or another. You don't have to focus on the X or the O's. The number of distractors can increase. It just pops out, which suggests that somehow or other, to a lot of people, you were, without particularly attending to a location or an object, somehow perceiving the X, which meant you could perceive without attention. And this is the proposition that Arien thought had some problems with. And Arien's claim was that there is no perception without attention. And without attention, there is inattentional blindness. Now, she's an experimental psychologist, so she did experiments. And let me describe the experiments that she did. What she did was she asked participants to fixate on the screen where you see the little tiny X, and then a large X would appear, and you would have to say whether the horizontal or the vertical line was longer. And it was a hard task because they weren't that hugely different. And then there's something called a mask, which it would appear, and the mask would prevent any more visual material from sitting around in what psychologists call your iconic memory. The non-critical trial was the one that you see right there. Nothing else on the array except that large X. In the critical trial, a little something, let's say like a line drawing of a Christmas tree or something like that, appeared to the side of the X. And then what Arien simply did was say, did you see anything besides the X? And 25% of her participants claimed not to see anything else. And what is, in my mind, even more interestingly, when you gave them a list of alternatives, and one of which was the little line drawing of the Christmas tree, they couldn't differentiate between the thing that was on that screen and the thing that hadn't been on the screen. They had no memory for that Christmas tree that had clearly appeared on the Christmas tree, but you were attending to the center of the screen and not to the periphery of the screen, if you like. So she did another experiment. Now she put the X on the periphery, and she put that little Christmas tree right in the place where you were fixating. And she said, don't look at where you're fixating, look at that big X. And even though your eye was on where the fixation point was, and we know from other research, you can move your attention without moving your eye. There's a dissociation between where attention is located and where your eye is fixated. And even under those situations, shockingly, not 25%, but 60 to 80% of the participants claimed not to see the Christmas tree. What she argued that the number increased so much is because you were at the point of fixation, you had to work to inhibit that area, and hence the inattentional blindness was even greater. Now, she then went on to ask an additional question. So all this stuff was happening outside, if you like, and I hesitate to use the word, but I will use it anyway, consciousness. And one of the ways psychologists think about this is that information impinges upon the sensorium. Lots of information. There's like many, many people here, and I can't take it all in. So I selectively tend to one person, that person sitting there by the name of Arien Mack. And at some point, I have to block out all this other information and look at Arien Mack. And the question is, where does that blocking or that bottleneck occur? It could occur very early on in the processing stream, which would suggest that you don't really do much with anything that's happening outside of attention or outside of consciousness. You don't do much with it. Or it can happen way further along, so you do a lot with it. You extract meaning and all of that. And what limits we seem to have is because you can't take that information and raise it up to consciousness. So she did some more experiments using basically the same design. And in this case, what the critical stimulus was not a little line drawing of a Christmas tree. The critical stimulus was a word. And she used what was called a STEM completion task, where she first asked, did you see it? And people say, no. Did you see anything? And they say, no. And then she said, well, one of the thing that was there which you didn't see began with FLA. What was the word? Did I get that wrong? I thought I got it right. But in any case, they filled in it with FLAK, F-L-A-K-E. And they would not have done it to the same degree if they had not previously seen the word, and they just had to say what word begins with F-L-A. She then went on to ask, well, what about, that really isn't semantic processing. So she did it again. And she again presented the word in the unattended area. And she said, and she used the word flake again. And then she showed these pictures. And voila, they pointed to the picture. Even though they claimed not to see anything, they pointed to the picture of the snowflake, suggesting to her that they were indeed semantically processing material which they were not attending to, which they were not aware of. So for her, attention is needed to become aware of visual stimuli. Stimuli impinge upon the sensorium is deeply processed, and Arien emphasized that as a consequence, that attention is not perception, and she said it's not perception because you can sit in a room in the dark waiting for someone to walk in and really have your attention focused on have somebody walking in, but you're not perceiving anything. The room is completely dark, let's say. So you can have attention without perception. And as I said, as I read it, that what she was claiming is that attention does not prevent deeper processing. Rather, it shapes what one is aware of. That it determines what you raise into your consciousness as opposed to what is processed unconsciously. And that is where I'm going to stop with the boring details. And Steve Pinker is going to inform us about what all this means. Steve Pinker, I lost my little sheet of all the wonderful things Steve Pinker did. So Steve Pinker is a chaired professor at Harvard University. He began his research in psycholinguistics and particularly the development of language. He wrote a trade book called Language Instincts, which did very well. And since then he has published a slew of various trade books that have sold many, many copies, including things like, I have the list of titles. He probably can tell you the list of titles. I don't know what happened to my little thing. But in any case, a lot of books And he, in 2004, was selected as one of the 100 most influential intellectuals or people in the United States, in the world, sorry, by Time magazine. So Steve, tell us why all of this is important.
What an honor to be appearing at an event honoring my dear friend Arien Mack, and I'm sorry I could not be there in person. I know Arien as a friend and a neighbor in Truro, Massachusetts. I know her from her work editing social research and her efforts to disseminate scholarly materials worldwide and to protect academic freedom worldwide. But I also know her because the two of us spent a good part of our professional lives in the same field, namely the experimental study of visual cognition, as Bill Hirst amply explained and lucidly and engagingly. What I would like to do is further explain why Arien's wide-ranging intellect alighted on this particular topic of attention and inattention blindness. Her interests are so vast, the astonishing range of topics covered in her journal, social research, as well as both dissemination of knowledge and protection of academic freedom on a global, not just a national scale. The study of visual attention and inattention blindness, in Arien's case, was not just a nerdy curiosity or an indulgence, but Arien is a meticulous and ingenious and revered scientist in a topic that in itself has broad implications for everyday life and for profound intellectual and practical affairs. So the phenomenon that Arien has studied is a distinction between pre-attentive cognitive processes. These are fast, unconscious, effortless, and in parallel, what we might call multitasking, as opposed to attentional cognitive processes, which are slower, conscious, effortful, and serial. There's a standard theory, which Arien has both helped to develop but has taken us beyond, according to which single visual features, little jots and tittles like angle, curvature, color, and motion, can be detected pre-attentively, but anything that requires a combination of them requires this limited serial conscious attention. Let me give you a simple demonstration. This one came in my email in 2008 to illustrate the distinction. First, it starts off with some searches for conjunctions of features. That is, you can't detect them simply by looking for an angle or a curve, but have to, but the thing that you're required to search for is defined by several features in conjunction. So this is the first example. Find the C below. Do not use any cursor help. And I think you'll agree it takes a while. Here it is over here, but it certainly didn't pop out. You had to scan over the display to find it. If you've already found the C, find the 6 below. I think you'd agree that the 6 as well, which can't simply be defined by a tail or a curve, but it's in there somewhere. I've shown this enough to know. Here it is. Okay. Once again, not such an easy task. Now find the N. It's even more difficult. Again, same vertical lines, same angles, same V-like shape, and it takes a while to discover it. Then, now can you find the 44th president? Now, the humor in this demo is that the 44th president can be distinguished from his predecessors by a single visual feature, in this case, skin color, a comment on the lack of diversity of presidents prior. Now, I used this demonstration in my classes for 8 happy years. And among the many reasons that I despaired in 2016 was that the example was no longer as apposite. But fortunately, when it comes to the 45th and 47th president, here too, a single visual feature, in this case color, can distinguish him from the predecessors. So the example still works. The point being that a single feature, in this case color, can be detected easily, and as we say, it pops out. Conjunctions of features like the 6 among the 9s require conscious attention. Among Arien's many contributions to this literature as Bill explained, are that there's some meaningful and well-learned combinations of features that may be processed pre-attentively, such as the case of the word flake, which, although not consciously detected, clearly was processed in terms of its meaning in order that the snowflake be identified. And that the more striking corollary is that it is not just that we have trouble detecting features or combinations of features without conscious attention, but that we are almost literally blind to them. That is, we cannot report that we saw them. Let me give you a couple of lifelike demonstrations of inattention blindness inspired by Arien's work. A famous one by Christopher Chabris and Dan Simons asks people to look at a demo of a video clip of some white-shirted and black-shirted pickup basketball players, and the task is to count the number of passes among the white-shirted players, ignoring the black-shirted players. I'll give you a very brief clip of the demo that the participants saw. So focus on the white-shirted players, count the number of passes, ignore the black-shirted players. Now, in this informal clip, I'm sure most of you saw a guy in a gorilla suit walk in the midst of these players and beat his chest before walking out. But in the actual demo, astonishingly, up to half of the participants had no awareness that a gorilla had entered the scene. Now, Arien studied it in a far more rigorous way, but in this video clip, as in her original demo, the fact that the unattended stimulus appeared dead center in the visual field did not actually allow it to intrude into the subject's awareness. There's another demonstration, an in vivo demonstration, where the experimental subject was an unwitting person on a sidewalk approached by the experimenters. This is by Dan Simons and Daniel Levin. Watch what happens as the unsuspecting pedestrian provides directions. Okay, let me show you. This is the man in the white hair. I believe he was a professor at the University of Illinois.
The young man on the left is one of the experimenters. He has approached the white-haired man and asked for directions. Watch closely as two people carrying a door pass between them, and the first experimenter is replaced by someone else.
So here again, half of the people in the role of the real-life subject failed to notice that they were suddenly talking to a different person because they were attending to providing the directions. Now, turns out there are many real-world examples of the pre-attentive and attentive distinction. Again, this is to emphasize that Arien's choice of a phenomenon to study in the laboratory was not a curiosity, but has many real-life implications. There are many kinds of visual recreation that hinge on the difficulty of applying attention to find a conjunction of features, like find the man in the coffee beans. I think you'll agree that it is not apparent that there is a man there, but here he is. And same color as the beans, same general contours, but only the particular configuration defines it as a face, and it's rather hard to find. Or the well-known comic strip Where's Waldo? They used to amuse kids in the back seat of a long car trip, where what makes it difficult to find our hero in the red and white toque and shock of brown hair in the visual cacophony is that here again the definition of Waldo-ness or Waldo-hood is this particular combination, and the graph has lots of distractors of the same features like the red and white stripes and various bits of brown that make it cognitively effortful to pick them out. Then the effect of semantic processing can be illustrated by this meme, which one of my students sent me after I lectured on visual attention. I got a dig bic, and the cup says, "You that read wrong. You read that wrong too." The error in reading this text is an illustration of how, without the particular constituents can come through, but the way that they are arranged can be misread. In this case, Arien could probably explain why there is something of a semantic influence as well. Now, there are many real-life phenomena, not just for recreation. In this case, has a recreational component, and that is that a lot of stage magic consists of the artful use of inattention blindness. That one of the reasons that stage magicians don't reveal their tricks is not that the tricks are so sophisticated, but on the contrary, that they are so simple, almost stupid, that they artfully depend on the magician directing the audience's attention to something else. They can do almost anything with the audience's attention directed somewhere else and can count on the fact that the audience will be blind to it. Even things as silly as the blindfolded psychic who claims to be able to read the letters on the blackboard through the blindfold. He will make sure that there is some distraction in the room and then just yank the blindfold down and look and pull the blindfold back up. Or the case of the famous self-proclaimed psychic Uri Geller, here shown on the Johnny Carson show, bending a spoon through sheer telekinetic power. Any stage magician, including Carson, who himself had a career as a stage magician before his long career as a talk show host, knows that you can do this just by making sure the audience is attending to something else. Then you can just bend the spoon against the leg of the chair, and you can just count on the fact that literally no one will see it. The bodies of animals in the process of evolution have taken advantage of the requirement of selective attention among their predators in order to evade detection. So in the case, say, of this owl or the white ptarmigan against the snowy background, a leaf insect, here clinging to the leaf and virtually invisible, or the flounder, which has the additional ability to change color, all hinge on the fact that without a great deal of selective attention, the predator's visual system will be blind to the similar combination of features. And just as one more demonstration of how a simple feature does not require attention, in this artificial display, you've got a butterfly against a background, which when it moves, activating a single feature, it's visible. The instant it stops moving, it literally disappears. One more demonstration here. We've got a bird shape against some pine needles. When it moves, it's visible. Also explaining why prey animals, as well as evolving the same set of features as their typical background, will freeze at the sign of danger because their predators will literally be blind to them. Has implications as well for the field of endeavors called human factors or user experience or cognitive ergonomics. That is, how do you design visual displays so that the relevant information will pop out at the user without requiring a lot of effortful attention? A number of years ago, Google developed a set of icons for its various apps, including Mail and Drive and, Mail, Drive, Maps, Video Chat, and Calendar. Then some genius in their graphic design team decided this was just too messy and inelegant. So they redesigned the app so they had the same color scheme, the same blue, red, yellow, and green, just in different configurations. The result being that you pretty much see them as pretty much the same thing, making the user experience worse in the name of graphic elegance, ignoring the phenomena of pre-attentive versus selective attention. You all recognize this. This is, your life may depend on it. The blue-shirted guy and the who works for TSA in the airport security line looks at a false color image of your carry-on baggage. He only has a few seconds to determine whether there is a bomb or a weapon. How does he or she do it? Well, in part, the false color is designed so that the typical ingredients of a bomb, organic matter with some electronics, will pop out in different colors from everything else that goes into a carry-on. If you want to get stopped by the TSA, put your travel alarm on top of a ham sandwich in your luggage. Each will pop out at a color that will signal to the beleaguered TSA officer that you may have a bomb. And an example that Arien herself used in one of her papers, we know from the examination of horrific plane crashes that a pilot whose attention is wrapped up in reading the dozens of gauges in the cockpit display, listening to air traffic control, can literally fail to see a plane in its direct path unless he is actually paying attention to it. So inattention blindness can have life or death consequences. It can also help in neurological assessment in a phenomenon called visual spatial neglect, which we now know tends to be caused by damage to the right parietal lobe. A patient asked, say, to copy a clock will copy only the numbers on the right side, only copy the right side of a house, only copy the right side of a flower, even though independent tests show that they are not literally blind to the left half of the visual world, but rather they are incapable of paying attention to the left half of the visual world, showing where in brain the damage is likely to occur and how it affects their experience and ability to cope. Let me just end by bringing up a couple of deep scientific and philosophical problems related to visual attention and inattention blindness, which I think repay the close, meticulous experimental attention that Arien has devoted to it. One of them is the issue of cognitive architecture, which is to say, what kind of a computational device is the human brain? Which mental functions have dedicated processors and work in parallel with minimal resource demands that support multitasking? And which mental functions share a single processor and demand limited cognitive resources, what's now called compute? Arien's work on pre-attentive versus attentive processing and inattention blindness bear on that fundamental issue in cognitive science. And they also bear on a topic that Bill was a little squeamish bringing up, but is directly related to Arien's work, namely consciousness. How can we understand the difference between conscious and unconscious mental processes in scientific terms? This is the distinction that has been famous at least since Sigmund Freud built a theory that depended on it. And a hypothesis from inattention blindness is that pre-attentive processing is unconscious. We know it takes place, but none of us can talk about it as it occurs in real time. And attention is the process that brings information into consciousness. So these are just some of the real-life phenomena, some of them whimsical, some of them of enormous practical importance, and the intellectually profound and intriguing phenomena that Arien's detailed work in the cognitive psychology lab have illuminated. So thanks to Arien for the work that you do in intellectual life in general, but thanks as well for the work that you do in the visual cognition lab.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'd like now to move from the lab to the real world, and both our dean and Ahmed will speak on the wonderful work and extremely important work that Arien has done on endangered scholars. I have a friend at the university, Catholic University of Louvain, that recently wrote to me and said that she has spent a good deal of her life working with endangered scholars, and she now realizes that now she has to begin practicing finding places for endangered scholars from the United States, which is a sad commentary in my mind. But in any case, Arien has done an extraordinary amount of work for quite a few years, and I think the first person I'd like to talk about that is Aleinikoff, who is, I don't think he needs introduction. He is the Dean of NSSR, and so somehow or other we will make him appear.
Arien, sorry I can't be there with you, but I'm delighted to participate in this wonderful celebration. You know, on this last several presentations on inattention blindness, I'm going to talk about something that you've been focused on, like a laser, and forced the rest of us to focus on as well. Let me start with this. This is a quote from Mustafa Alabsi, who's a professor of political philosophy. He fled Syria, and he says this. He says, "Dear Arien, meeting you and being one of the consortium members was an incredible event and a chance for me. You're a source of inspiration and a lesson in commitment and generosity." Well, what is this consortium that Mustafa refers to here? It started this way. Arien had an idea. And if you know Arien, then you know that ideas quickly become plans, and plans pretty quickly become projects. And if Arien asks you to join in her project, then you're committed for life. For me, this began about 8 years ago. Arien had long been concerned about the freedom of scholars, not just academic freedom, but physical freedom, scholars who've been forced from their universities and their countries of origin. Now, as everyone here knows, this was how the graduate faculty at NSSR began. President Alvin Johnson traveled to Europe in the 1930s and arranged for more than a dozen academics, leading lights in the social sciences, who'd been expelled from German universities to come to the New School. They were first known as the University in Exile at the New School, then adopted the name of the Graduate Faculty in Social Sciences, and now we're known as the New School for Social Research, NSSR. The graduate faculty established the journal Social Research, which, as you'll hear more about in the second part of the proceedings today, Arien edited for more than half a century. This is our history, it's our heritage, it's a crucial part of how we see ourselves even today. So now fast forward to the second decade of the 21st century. Arien, as you know, is a watcher of the world. She's intensely engaged in political and academic developments around the globe, and she saw an academy under threat in too many places. Scholars who, like Mustafa, had fled the civil war in Syria, Turkish academics who were expelled from universities if their teaching and research displeased President Erdogan, Viktor Orban had forced the Central European University to leave Hungary. Scholars from Bangladesh, China, Iran, other countries are unable to do what the world expects scholars to do, to teach and research freely for the advancement of human knowledge. Why not, thought Arien, a second university in exile? Well, this was the irresistible thought that occurred to an indefatigable person. Arien recognized that the New School couldn't do what we'd done in the 1930s. We couldn't bring in a score of academics to join the faculty. So she set out to contact and convince other institutions of higher education to join in her efforts. And each participating school would agree to host and support at least one rescued scholar. And this was the birth of the new University in Exile Consortium. Listen to Noor Audi, also from Syria, who has an MD and PhD in public health. Arien's vision and leadership in the University in Exile Consortium has been truly transformative. Through her unwavering commitment, she not only safeguarded academic freedom, but has also created a lifeline for scholars facing adversity. Since I first met her in 2018, I've been deeply inspired by her dedication to fostering intellectual change, providing refuge for scholars uprooted from their homes, and her work stands as a testament to the power of scholarship as a force of resilience, justice, and global solidarity. But for Arien, it wasn't just enough to have a few universities accept a few rescued scholars. So she set out to increase the number of participating institutions. And she also believed that the scholars themselves should be part of a larger collective. So she arranged for an annual conference of the scholars. She brought the scholars together from the various sponsoring universities in an online seminar that would meet weekly. And then, with the help of Nicole and Abby, she established online courses taught by pairs of scholars open to students around the world. And this is where things stand today. The consortium now has 70 member institutions in 17 countries. More than 300 rescued scholars have found safety at one of these academic institutions. Scholars have taught 50 courses with 14,000 registrants, all from the mind of Arien Mack and from unending hard work to bring this about. You know, as we gather tonight, we face new challenges to the academy and to the professoriate. Suddenly, it's students, postdocs, faculty in the United States who are at risk of being dismissed, deported for their politics and their ethnicity. The trampling of free speech rights and academic freedom may come to surpass earlier times in our history when those in power sought to score political points by punishing the vital work of our institutions of higher education. How should we respond to these deadly serious challenges? I know what Arien will do. She'll seek to defend the values of higher education, to stand up for the academy, to which she has devoted more years of hard work than most of us at this celebration have been alive. And maybe she'll do this. Maybe she'll have an idea that will become a plan and then a project, a new university in exile outside the United States, where free thought and free inquiry can survive and thrive. And if she calls you to join in this effort, let's see if you'll be able to resist. Let me end with comments of Yin Yin Win, who's an exiled scholar from Myanmar, now at Yale University. Arien, your compassion and advocacy for displaced scholars have provided a platform to continue our invaluable work and a sense of belonging and hope. You've given voices to those silenced by adversity, fostering an environment where intellectual freedom and scholarly excellence thrive despite their challenges. I extend my most profound respect and gratitude from those whose lives you have uplifted. May your work continue to inspire and illuminate for many years to come. Arien, thanks for creating the New University in Exile Consortium. It has affected the lives of hundreds of people.
Alex, thanks for being so movingly in your appreciation of not just Arien, but the work that she's doing and her impact on so many people. The next person I wanted to introduce is Ahmed Bawa. He is a theoretical physicist, but he's also Chief Executive Officer of the Universities South Africa, which is an association of universities in South Africa. He's held other administrative positions over his lifetime, as well as doing work in the area of theoretical physics. To move things on, I turn to him to. Arien reminds me that he is also a member of the consortium advisory board. And so he can speak authoritatively about the consortium. So I introduce him to you.
It really is a special occasion, and Arien is a very special person, so it's a great privilege for me. I first met Arien in about 2004 while I was at the Ford Foundation, where I was sort of working on the Africa Higher Education Initiative at the Ford Foundation. And then after that, while I was in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Hunter College, where Judith Friedlander was the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and I believe she's in the audience today. I was introduced to Arien by my partner, Rukeya, who worked at the Carnegie Corporation and who was working with Arien on the journal donation project, which completely captured my imagination at a time when journals were simply not inaccessible luxury to scholars at most African universities. Arien was keen to do a 10-year update on South Africa's post-apartheid transition as a social research issue. And we did collect a really stellar cast of writers for that issue. And it is not uncommon even today to see those articles cited in new writing. I remember feeling slightly intimidated at that first meeting, and yet I knew even then that I would enjoy working with her. What I discovered quite quickly, even at that first meeting, it was her ability to zoom in on important essences, while my mind was sort of in a thick, tangled forest of ideas. And as I attended meetings of the Social Research Advisory Board, I saw just how effective this was. One has favorite meetings, and the Social Research Advisory Board meetings were always fun. This is a testament largely to Arien's ability to create a board that was edgy, testy, and sometimes fraught with temper, but always collegial and congenial. These meetings were fun too, because Arien was able to bring together really interesting groups of people on specific topics. The Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall demonstrations in South Africa brought that higher education system to a catastrophic paralysis. Working through the crisis, one couldn't help but grapple with the raw detail that there was absolutely no defense of that university system, not from business and industry, not from government, not from the communities from which our students were drawn, and not from the trade union movement that was always so vocal. Deafening silence. One had to ask, who owns these public institutions? Why is there such a low ownership, social ownership of these essential institutions? To some, they were seen to be complicit in producing and reproducing the gross poverty and inequalities that so define South Africa. And now we are at the point again, but on a more global scale, who will stand up for the universities and for science in the US and elsewhere at a time when they are under such devastating pressure? And what is the role of the universities in addressing this dismal kind of level of social ownership? Arien's Center for Public Scholarship foresaw this moment in history, making it clear that universities were somehow too comfortable in their skins, surfing turbulence by becoming increasingly instrumentalist and subservient to narrow national and sectarian interests, instead of carving out a space shaped by and for their inherent purposes. The future of universities, whether in China, Brazil, Russia, India, Nigeria, France, or the US, should be of paramount interest to all of us when so many of the grand challenges that face humanity are simultaneously local and global in scale. Coming out of that issue of social research, South Africa, the second decade, I was particularly struck by the fragility of our nascent democracy, notwithstanding the continuing euphoria at the time that so defined South Africa. Reflecting on what was going on around the world, this was 2005, 2006, it occurred to me that the stresses and strains that we saw in this nascent democracy had representations in other, much older, much more established democracies. I mentioned this to Arien, and together with Arjun Appadurai, we drafted a proposal for the Open Society Foundation and other foundations along the lines of liberal democracies in crisis. This was back in 2005, 2006, and at a time when this idea was seen, at least by those foundations, to be quite preposterous. I think the point I'm trying to make is that, going back 20 years almost, already Arien had been sort of engaging with ideas which have become so prevalent now. There is so much to say about Arien as we celebrate her today. The creation of the new university in exile, which Alex has described so fully, would surely have flummoxed most of us. She was driven to intervene in what she saw as a crisis in global academia, as thousands of scholars face the devastating consequences of war, of oppression, of political violence, of race and ethnic cleansing. And it is a wonderful invention that has captured the imagination not only of the scholars it serves, but also of many of us who are connected with it in many different ways, driven by this energy and passion of its founder, and by the pure hope that it may work for the scholars themselves. It really is a beacon at this time of deep malaise. And it's a an invention that is a bridge between a really deeply fracturing world. It's interesting how connections between people develop. As sometimes happens, I had a sense in the first few minutes of that first meeting in 2004 that we would become not just good colleagues, but also good friends and good comrades, as we would say in South Africa. It seemed to me already then that somehow I had known her my whole life, and that's how it has been since. We speak to each other nearly every Sunday, sharing news about family, friends, and the weather, but also about what's going on globally. Arien is easily drawn to action by the plight of young students, scholars, and artists devastated by war and oppression, which abound in many parts of the world. I sometimes have the urge to say to her, I don't think we can help this situation or that one, but I know that she will not listen to me. Instead, we think together, and I too am captured by this passion that she exudes. Thank you very much, Arien, and it's absolutely wonderful to be somebody that knows you, and thank you very much.
So that ends the one half of Arien's life, and we will now shift to talking about what has been a theme throughout, and that is the embattled university. I don't know, endangered and embattled. And there was, as I said, a recent social research issue on this topic, and contributors of the research of the issue will appear somehow magically at that table. And Oz Frankel will MC this part of the proceedings.
Good evening. Thank you, Bill. I promise not to say palimpsest even once. And I'll surprise you to no end by saying something about Arien first. So we had a story from our president. I'll give it a little bit more flesh and sinews. The story that Arien tells is that Hannah Arendt came to her office. The year was 1970, and tried to convince her to accept this position. And Arien did not throw her out of the office, but said, yes, Arendt said it will change your life, and you agree, it did change your life. And those were 54 years, which is quite amazing. I don't think there's anything comparable in the annals of academic publishing in the United States. The journal was initially launched in 1934. It was a vehicle for the university in exile, and Alvin Johnson presented it as a way to bring European knowledge to bear on new territory, certainly in the United States, but also globally. The title of the journal is Social Research and International Quarterly. And the international idea is very, very important. The journal, until the late 60s, published miscellany of articles about, predominantly I think about economics and sociology, and Arien took over and changed it radically. So since the beginning of the 1970s, the journal is dedicated to theme-based issues. Every issue has a single theme, and all contributors are solicited, are chosen. It's a list that is curated by Arien and the editorial board. In its new guise, under Arien's leadership, I think the journal really fulfilled the promise, the ethos, the spirit of the University in Exile, the graduate faculty, now the New School for Social Research, because of its commitment to humanistic social science that is constantly in conversation with philosophy and history. I think I won't be popular for saying that, but that's part of the European, even Germanic legacy of the founders of the New School. And Arien says don't be mad at me. Arien says that she was born a psychologist, but she's really a philosopher. And I think that was part of her approach to editing this journal, deep intellectualism, and something of the intellectual verve of New York after 1945 has been very much part of the, I think, the sensibility that guides this publication ever since. We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity. It's a good word to use. It has value. But the social research has been doing interdisciplinarity for many decades now, because it was devised originally to serve a reader who has an interest outside the boundaries of his or her discipline. Arien in general actually sought to undermine the boundaries between academia and the general public, the public at large. In 1988, she established the Social Research Conference Series that operated under the Center for Public Scholarship. It's another institution that she established. There's no end to it. In January, last January, a couple of months ago, the Council of Editors of Learned Journals honored Arien with the Distinguished Editor Award for 2024. And I'll read a little bit of the decision. They cite her broad vision to elevate the journal from an academic publication to a wide-ranging forum for public discourse. A hands-on collaborative management style successfully brought together an editorial board and many contributors to the service of this vision. The journal layout offers a simple, no-frill style. The essays, which are highly readable and interconnected, are largely jargon-free, consistent with Mack's desire to bridge academic and public discourse. So to a large extent, the quality of the journal, the quality of individual issues have to do with Arien's excellent sense of judgment, good taste, and I would say even sense of humor. That's certainly part of it. And I think that Arien life's work is a model to us all. Thank you, we are in debt to you. And as I told you before, we all bask in your glory. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge the members of the editorial board who are in the audience today. Also our managing editor who sits over there, Anna Paretskaya, next to our former managing editor, Kara Schlesinger. And our two student workers, Corina and Rhiannon, they're over there. And now we move from celebration to a wake. That is the Embattled University. It was born, as you heard before, about a year and a half ago. I don't know if you remember, but life was better back then. And it wasn't so good. And it became incredibly timely in a way that is painful and acute. But then again, most of the contributions to the issue were written before January 1st, 2024. So we are a little bit behind in terms of addressing the daily avalanche of bad news coming from the White House and the rest of the administration. Let me read you a bit of the solicitation letter that Arien and the co-editor Arjun Appadurai sent back then. They say it's clear that American research universities are facing a Bermuda Triangle of challenges. This includes attacks on academic freedom and free speech from both sides of the political spectrum, unprecedented pressures on university presidents to avoid controversial statements on major issues, new pressures on universities to serve as adjudicators of civil rights and social identity claims, battles over the curriculum between advocates of newly mobilized social movements and votaries of the virtues of various canons. In addition, prosaic issues, shrinking enrollments, poor financial management, and dwindling charitable gifts pose major budgetary challenges. So many of the contributions, I think, do we have the table of contents? Oh.
I have it, but I didn't know you were going to use it.
Okay, maybe you should. Yeah. So many of the contributions are really focused on the internal challenges of higher education. Right, the politicization of knowledge, free speech, neoliberalism in modern academy, the administration of universities, the reliance on donors, and so on and so forth. But those issues, even while we are watching not the Bermuda Triangle, but the tsunami of bad news coming from Washington, are still with us, and we believe will continue to haunt academia in the future as well. And maybe academia has been in crisis for many, many decades. Right, that has been the case throughout the 20th century. Crisis because of intellectual skirmishes, material issues, questions about identity, functionality. And perhaps the modern university is always prone to crisis because of the expectations that are always incredibly high, utopian, even totalizing. And of course, I belong to a university that has been in crisis from 1919. I once proposed to rename it the Permanent Crisis University. I don't know. I tend to be right. Okay, so that's what we do in the next hour and a half. I asked my distinguished guest here today these are all contributors to the issue of Embattled University. I'll present them one by one, but I'm sure that they are known to most of you. I asked them shortly to talk about the contribution, then we'll have a short discussion among ourselves, and we'll bring the issues under consideration to the here and now. And I'll ask them what can be done, obviously, and then we'll open the discussion to questions, commentary, remarks from the audience. So let us begin. I'll begin with David Hollinger. I'll read his credential. He's a Preston Hotchkiss Professor of History Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also my old mentor. Hi, David. He's a former president of the Organization of American Historians and elected member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His books include Post-Ethnic America, Beyond Multiculturalism, Science, Jews, and Secular Culture After Cloven Tongues of Fire, Protestant Abroad, and Christianity's American Fate. I believe this is your last book.
Correct.
Please.
For the first time in American history, we have a major political party with a vested interest in keeping the educational level of the voters low. Now, this is in some ways an astonishing fact about the history of the United States, which has generated remarkably little explicit discussion. My paper for this journal, for this issue of the journal, deals with three questions about this reality. One, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where the Republican Party is so committed to keeping education low? Second, what does this change in the public life of the United States do for universities? How does it change the situation of higher education? Third, in this specific setting, this relatively new context, what can universities do to maintain their integrity as knowledge-centered institutions committed to the discovery, the dissemination, and the defense of truth? Now, of these three questions. I think I have the most to contribute as a historian to the first of these, how did we get here? So my brief remarks here will be mostly about that. Before I get to that, I will say with regard to the other questions, the second question, like what has this done to American universities? Remarkably, it has put higher education in the situation of being much more identified with the policies of the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Now, if you think about what education can do for people's response to the public issues of our time, pretty quickly you can say that education does certain things. Education enables people to better understand the evidence for global warming. Education better enables people to appreciate the value of vaccines. Education better enables people to understand that the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow has a debilitating effect on the descendants of people who experienced it. Education makes it easier to understand how women's lives can be extended and expanded as a result of reproductive choice. Education makes it possible to understand the Nakba as a basic feature of modern history. Education makes it possible to be skeptical about the QAnon conspiracy theories that are so prominent among Republican voters. Education makes it possible to be more easily persuaded of the evidence about who won the presidential election of 2020. Education makes it possible to more easily see through the lies of Donald Trump. Now, that's just a condition that turns out to put higher education and an advance of education at greater odds with Republicans. The Republican Party is, after all, the party of Earl Warren and Thomas Dewey. The Republican Party is the party of Nelson Rockefeller that built the State University of New York. The Republican Party is the party that did more than the Democrats to build the University of California system. The Republican Party has produced senators and governors of stature throughout modern history. That's not the case now. So that's a really important change. The other question, the last question that I've asked about, what do we deal with all this? How we defend ourselves in this setting is made extremely difficult because of our greater sensitivity, and I think that's a true statement, our greater sensitivity to the social injustice that surrounds us. Our greater sensitivity to that social injustice makes us tempted to fall into a trap. The trap is to accept more than our share of responsibility for the injustices that define the society. The trap is for us to take on more things. After all, the unstated motto of the people in the United States who systematically refuse to provide basic education and social services to a lot of people that need it, their basic motto is, let the professors do it. Let the universities come in and make all these changes. Let the universities pick up the social pieces that are left lying around the floor of the United States as a result of the systematic failure of other institutions to do their job. So the temptation for us is we will do it all. We will do it all. And that leads to a lot of terrible mistakes, one of which is the requirement, the recommendation that applicants for faculty appointments sign DEI statements. Now, a number of us have been campaigning against this for a long time, but of course now, if you've read the New York Times as the digital edition today, the University of California is now doing away with this, but it turns out that it's listed as a conservative triumph. So all of us who are advocating against this on the basis of academic freedom are now characterized as conservatives. That's an example of where an effort to turn universities into all-purpose engines for social reform has diminished our capacity to maintain our integrity as knowledge-centered institutions. Now, the other question, how did we get there? It's interesting that the matter of education and the political parties did not become prominent in public discussion until this last election, when the pollsters turned out to discover that the ethno-racial and gender distinctions, which we've been led for so many years to believe explain everything, weren't as good at explaining the results of the election of 2024 as educational level. But actually, the differences educationally are not new to 2024. Donald Trump did not campaign in high education states in 2016 or 2020. Trump did not make any effort to win the electoral votes of any of the Eastern Corridor states except Pennsylvania, and he made no effort to do any of the Pacific states of Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii. Going back to 2016, before Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, the Republicans had already given up almost all states and congressional districts with high educational levels. In 2016, of the 32 senators that represented the high education states of the East and the Pacific Coast, there were only 2 senators from the Republican Party. Systematically, year after year, the Republican Party gave up on higher educated voters. Now, why was this? There are many things that go into this, but the key, I think, was the decision of the Republican Party to adopt the Southern strategy. Now, we've all read about the Southern strategy. There are 2 things about the Southern strategy we don't usually read very much about. They were not hidden, but we haven't read much about them. One was, it was a religious strategy, because evangelical Protestants are by far overrepresented demographically in the same states that were relevant to the Southern strategy. Second, those are the same states that have the lowest educational level, by and large, in the United States. We need to begin talking about the Southern strategy as also a religious strategy and as an educational strategy. Now, the legacy of that is that the Republican Party finds out that the voters that they reach that way are really reliable. You can count on them. And as a result, they become increasingly disinclined to do anything that violates their interests and sensibilities. Gradually then, the Republican Party is captured by its evangelical client. And so today, at a time when the United States is experiencing greater and greater secularization, we have an increasingly religious politics. So our situation today is that an increasingly secular society is saddled with an increasingly religious politics. The Republican Party has been captured by its evangelical client.
Yeah. You can clap. Nicholas Dirks is the president of the New York Academy of Sciences. He was previously chancellor of UC Berkeley, and before that, executive vice president and dean of the Faculty of the Arts and Sciences of Columbia, where he was also the Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology and History. His major books include The Hollow Crown, Casts of Mind, and Scandal of Empire, and most recently, City of Intellect, the Uses and Abuses of the University. Please.
So thank you, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Arien, it's a pleasure to actually meet you. For the first time, we were looking for the event tonight and ran into each other, and I don't know if she recognized me, but I knew that if I wasn't in the right place, I was with the right person. But it's an honor, and I've been following social research for years, and this was the first time anybody ever asked me to write in it, so I'm delighted to be part of it. I received the letter inviting my contribution to the volume on the Embattled University over the Thanksgiving weekend of 2023. I had just finished proofing a book I wrote, the last one that you mentioned, City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University, and believed at that point it was the last word, and in fact, probably the last 110,000 words that I shouldn't have written, that I would ever write about the university. It is an unfortunate custom on the part of people who have been in positions of presidents or chancellors of universities to write memoirs of one sort or another, and they are a dreadful, dreadful genre, and I nevertheless contributed to it. But I wrote it because I believe that some of the things that I struggled with, in particular during my time at the University of California, Berkeley, would be helpful in thinking through what I took to be at that point the crisis of the American university. And at that point, actually the years when I really wrote this, we were in the pandemic, which of course is a great time to write because I had little else to do. But it was nevertheless clear to me already that there had been things that I had observed at Berkeley that I had participated in that had happened, which David, of course, lived through with me, that were forebodings of things to come. And indeed, things often do happen at Berkeley first, but they don't stay there. And we had some of the first riots on campus around controversial speakers. We had major disputes between Antifa and Proud Boys. We had all kinds of examples, I think, of exchanges that tested the limits of the American university, and yet which were always dealt with in reference to the history of the university, which of course was the home of free speech. And it was the free speech movement of 1964 that in some sense led to our current situation. Before 64, I think everybody knows this, but nevertheless it bears repeating. Before 64, the general idea was that public universities at least should be neutral political spaces, where political speech would get in the way of the intellectual exchange of research and education.
He's looking at me because I was in the free speech movement.
And he was there. But the point is, there was a very different interpretation of the provenance of the First Amendment with respect to public higher education until the free speech movement, which of course was led by students, participated in by faculty, and faculty, you weren't yet faculty, but on December 8th, 1964, supported the students, which led to the adoption of the idea that the First Amendment applied, and in fact had to apply to public universities in America and spread everywhere. So that spread. And of course, 2 years later, Ronald Reagan, running for the governorship of the state of California, ran largely on a campaign to clean up the mess at Berkeley, by which he meant both the protests that had taken place in '64, but also the kind of general licentiousness that he called out repeatedly on the campaign trail. It's not dispositive perhaps, but I nevertheless think it was probably the major reason he was able to defeat Pat Brown and attain the presidency, attain the governorship of California in November of 1966. And one of the first things he did, he didn't do it, but he enabled it and in some ways did do it. One of the first things he did, of course, was to fire the president of the University of California, Clark Kerr. So there's a kind of history where Berkeley, was fundamental in creating a set of conventions that were nevertheless highly contentious around the free exchange of ideas, political as well as anything else, which then seemed to me to take on a kind of life and history of its own. Now I'm going to say, just as an anecdote, and just stop me when my 7 minutes are up. But I've had the privilege to serve as the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Columbia. I took over from Ira, and to be the 10th Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. And it's quite astonishing, even when you read in the pages of the New York Times, as I did on Sunday, in the discussion that took place among several opinion writers at the Times, that according to one of the opinion writers at the New York Times, Columbia and Berkeley are the two institutions that are factories for producing Maoist cadres. That's an exact quote from Bret Stephens, just by the way, where I've had the privilege to work. And the first Maoist I've actually encountered on either campus, I think, is coming from somewhere in Washington, D.C. right now, because it feels like the Cultural Revolution. Anyways, small aside. But I did experience what I took to be contradictions around questions that had to do with free speech during my time at Berkeley. In 2014, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement. And every fall, the chancellors of each campus at the University of California are enjoined, literally instructed by the president of the system, to send out what is an annual message that has been scripted by, that is part of the principles of community, that's been scripted by different constituencies that are part of the university, effectively encouraging civility on campus. Civility, which is meant to include in its definition the kind of respect that might be accorded to people with whom you have serious disagreements, even in the context of protest, although not specifically about protest, really much more germane to just the kind of emphasis on debate and dialogue, exchange across difference. And I decided to wrap the commemoration of the free speech movement around the message about civility, only of course to have a number of my colleagues at Berkeley write angrily to me that I was somehow abrogating or abridging the right of free speech by even using the term civility in the same sentence. And I did not intend that, of course, but I wrote a second message, as one does, and emphasized that I meant by this only that free speech could be exercised in protest, but it could also be exercised, perhaps most productively, in a university in which people did try to engage across great differences, the ways in which they think in often diametrical ways. So I got blowback from that. 2 years and 3 months, 4 months later, Milo Yiannopoulos, a Cambridge dropout who was working at the time for Breitbart News and who was picked up by the Young Americans for Freedom and supported to do a tour of American campuses that he called the Dangerous Faggot Tour, came to Berkeley. There had already been some serious violence that had broken out at the University of Washington in Seattle, at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and at UC Davis. But nevertheless, Yiannopoulos had been invited by the Berkeley College Republicans. Again, it was funded by the Young Americans for Freedom. And he was invited, and he was going to talk, and I was implored by many of the same faculty who had criticized my statement about civility. I was implored to cancel the visit of Milo Yiannopoulos. I was told that he would cause immeasurable harm. And harm was a term that was used not just for what could have been, or what what we worried would be, in fact, physical harm, physical violence, but also the harm of speech. And of course, this was, part of campus discourse really at the time. But I nevertheless felt strongly that even though I found Yiannopoulos loathsome, that on the campus that birthed free speech on public American universities, to cancel the visit of someone would run completely against the grain of the principles of the university. And so even though it made me even more unpopular than I already was, it made me a lot of enemies. I nevertheless insisted that he come. The event was closed down by a group of about 125 protesters who appeared from off campus wearing masks, caps, backpacks dressed in black, self-identified by some of them as Antifa, but it was hard to say. It was all anonymous. And they very, very skillfully closed down the event. And it was called off, in fact, not by me. I was waiting to make a judgment on the basis of the growing crowd and some reports of potential violence, but by the chief of police who was on the scene and decided at some point when they'd broken into the student union that not only was the venue endangered, but also the speaker who was in the basement in the green room. And so called it off immediately. Yiannopoulos was escorted to a local hotel. He immediately got on YouTube and began to broadcast that Berkeley had closed down his speech and not allowed him to speak. $100,000 worth of damage to both the campus and the city of Berkeley. And it was a long night. The protesters were not Berkeley students, because about 2 hours later, after a bunch of ATMs and bank windows had been broken in the city of Berkeley, the group came back to campus and announced that they were going to come to the chancellor's house. But they didn't, because they didn't know where it was. So we determined that they were. But so anyway, so somewhere close to midnight, they finally disappeared, and the campus went back to peace. Next morning, I woke up. There was a tweet from President Trump saying, "No free speech at Berkeley," caps, "no federal funds," exclamation point. February 2nd, 2017. You can Google it. And I have to say that at the time, it was surprising, both because we had honored free speech, or we had done everything we could to honor free speech within the power of the university, but also because this was, 2-3 weeks into the first Trump administration. And at the time, I must say, I didn't take it all that seriously. My worry, and this is really the point of this story, my worry was that even though we had done everything we could to honor free speech, there clearly had been a major breakdown in terms of a kind of consensus, I'll call it a liberal consensus, about the meaning of free speech on campus. And this is something that, as someone who is dyed in the wool Foucauldian, I understand arguments about, but which nevertheless I came increasingly to believe was something that was very dangerous to the ongoing enterprise of the university, largely because the problem, of course, is that you close somebody else's speech down and you will invite them to do the same to you. And of course, the truth of the matter was that there were not only many, many people on campus who were against his coming to speak, but in the student newspaper 2 days later, there were 4 columns by students, all of which applauded the work of the outside protesters. So it was not something that was seen as a hostile act. And that then, in a very fundamental sense, occasioned the topic of the paper that I wrote for Social Research, which was to try to understand if there was something in our intellectual history, people who have, like me, been part of the university for decades, very, very initially through protests in the 1960s and 70s around Vietnam, but increasingly participated in the university through theorizing the ways in which power inflects all kinds of social, historical, economic, political relationships. But was there some way in which we had abandoned a certain set of liberal principles that the university, including the work that we were doing intellectually, depended upon? And so in the paper, I go back and I look at some of the kinds of recent critiques that have charged this intellectual tradition with the sin of having effectively occasioned the current crisis in the university. And these are books by Susan Neiman and Yasha Monk and Francis Fukuyama and others, not the Alan Blooms and right-wing screes and so on and so forth. And I worried about that problem, and I worried about what the kind of intellectual basis for reconstituting some kind of foundation for the kinds of things that we all believed, even if we didn't always say so, were so precious with respect to the freedom that we had within the university. And so, we fast forward now to the present. And I feel like that paper, in some sense, has to be completely rewritten. I think I'm not the only one in the volume who worries that, that was then and here we are. The clear assault on the university is one that partakes of no commensurability. It's not that what was done then ever can excuse or is in any way commensurable to the kinds of things that are being done now. And of course, I think that we are in a crisis that is going to just get worse and worse and worse. There's a plan, there's a playbook, and you want me to stop? Yeah.
We'll get to the plan.
There's a plan and a playbook for what happens, and we'll talk about that, I gather, anon. But again, my paper was trying to understand the extent to which, to some extent, we had to go back to some of the principles that underwrote what we really believe to be the idea of the university. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you move down a little bit?
Lisa Anderson is a special lecturer and James Shortwell, Professor of International Relations Emerita and Dean Emerita at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She also served as Provost and President of the American University in Cairo. Among her books are The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya between 1830 and 1980, and Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science, and Public Policy in the 21st Century. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to spend most of my time rehearsing my paper for you, but I did want to thank Social Research and Arien for inviting me to reflect on this, because it's been quite a lot of fun, actually, but also to thank them for permitting me to use one of my favorite article titles several years ago. I was invited to reflect on a book that I thought was very important, and I chose Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And in the title, I wanted to quote the President of the United States, so we called it Shithole Countries. And I don't think many other journals would have permitted that, so thank you very much. Okay, as you can probably tell, my essay for this issue is called From Pursuing Truth to Managing Stress, the Costs and Consequences of the Therapeutic Turn in American Universities. And although, as with all of them, this was certainly written largely before the re-election of President Trump and the current events in the academy, I actually think this is a set of observations that are useful for us thinking about, in part, why it is we have been relatively ineffective at addressing this assault on the universities. Why are we, if we're embattled, not better equipped? So obviously the argument is something about what has happened at universities over the course of the last few decades. But I'm going to start with a quote from the then president of Columbia. Several days after the Hamas attack of October 7th, the then president broadcast, as many did, a message of concern for our community. Like virtually all of her counterparts in American colleges and universities who sent out similar messages, she began in the first person. I was devastated, she said, by the horrific attack and so forth. She went on to, quote, assure each of you that Columbia will provide any measure of care or comfort that we can. And the letter ended with a list of university resources that included university counseling and psychological services, university health services, the Office of the University Chaplain, the Office of Religious Life, the International Students and Scholars Office, and University Life. This reading of a major political cataclysm as a mental health crisis was hardly unique to Columbia. Nearly all of the statements from universities about the Hamas attack took the same approach. The president was devastated, and here are the mental health resources, which seemed to me quite striking at the time. Obviously, in retrospect, the effort to staunch the flow of condemnation that these were inadequate statements of various kinds failed. University presidents were soon in the crosshairs of political debates that were about far more than the quality of their leadership or the complexity of Middle East politics. And within several years, the president of Harvard had resigned, the president of Cornell retired, and the president of Columbia left office. By that time, Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance's 2021 declaration that universities are the enemy had gained widespread attention, not least because he was selected as Donald Trump's running mate. So it was pretty clear that we were in the crosshairs at that point. And I think there are a lot of aspects to this, some of which have been addressed by my colleagues, but I really want to think through, and this was the purpose of the paper, why it was that everything seemed to be brought down to this being a mental health crisis, that this was something that the principal concern of the administration was the trauma that was being experienced by students on campus. The focus on care and wellness and health and safety were not merely evidence of presidential public relations gone wrong, although they were clearly that, but a more profound and profoundly disabling reorientation of the putative purposes of universities away from learning and discovery in favor of a vision of institutions as wellness centers and safe spaces. And so by the time President Trump was reelected, the university's therapeutic turn seemed to have reached grotesque dimensions. As the Chronicle of Higher Education reported, in the aftermath of the election, a number of universities offered its graduate students, their graduate students, I'm paraphrasing here, self-care suites with Legos, coloring books, and milk and cookies. The Harvard Divinity School had story time and the ministrations of a puppet named Sunshine, and so forth. People brought their dogs. People participated with those fidget things. The Chronicle asked whether this is what the students really needed. And it was not obvious that treating the democratic process as a traumatic threat from which students needed protection, that was actually preparing them for citizenship. So it was in that context that this stunning sort of therapeutic turn seemed to me to be worth exploring. And I think the adoption of the psychotherapeutic approaches was not restricted entirely to the university administration and the wellness folks. And I talk a little bit about the fact that the adoption of behavioral economics and so forth was also part of what was happening on the academic side, or the research side of the House, which I will not rehearse in any detail. But I think the interesting question then becomes, where does this come from? Why is it that this therapeutic term in both university management and academic discourse come from? So I make the argument that this is really a reflection of an effort to address some of the tensions of a higher education sector that is simultaneously trying to claim, at least, to be promoting creativity and critical thinking and so forth and so on, but at the same time really not wanting any problems. Risk management culture is in some tension with critical thinking. And how do you resolve cognitive dissonance? Wellness centers, to put it very boldly. so that the risk management approach that has been described in many ways by many of my colleagues and with which you are undoubtedly familiar was associated with increasing concern about the finances of universities that began with the declining public sector support for universities in the 1980s. Thank you for mentioning Ronald Reagan. Over the course of time, that culture of concern with the financial health of the university as being one of the primary metrics by which you could determine success also meant that you had a culture of risk management and so forth that began to sort of infuse the way managers of universities were thinking. And I quote in the paper Bill Ackman's remarkable observations in his long screed about Claudine Gay and DEI and so forth at Harvard, something that I think is worth reading. As a side note, says he, I can't believe that this was a tweet. It's so long. I would suggest that universities should broaden their searches to, that is presidential searches, to include capable business people for the role of president, as a university president requires more business skills than can be gleaned from even the most successful academic career, with hundreds of peer-reviewed papers and many books. Universities have a dean of the faculty and a bureaucracy to oversee the faculty and academic environment of the university. It therefore does not make sense that the university president has to come through the ranks of academia with a skill set unprepared for university management. The president's job, managing thousands of employees, overseeing a $50 billion endowment, raising money, that's Harvard, of course, raising money, managing expenses, capital allocation, real estate acquisition, disposition, and construction, and reputation management are responsibilities that few career academics are capable of executing. Broadening the recruiting of candidates to include top business leaders would also create more opportunities for diverse talent for the office of university president. So this is the world in which we're trying to operate. So what does that have to do with a therapeutic turn? Well, let me point out one thing about the university presidents that replaced the people who I described earlier as having stepped down or retired. They're all MDs. So the interim president at Columbia is an MD, the president of Cornell is an MD, the president of Penn is an MD, and the president of Harvard is an MD. So there are probably other people out there, but those were the ones I was looking at in the paper. So the culture of care becomes a natural instinct. So they were also, all of them, quite accomplished university administrators. But let me read you the most recent, it's actually the penultimate statement from the university president at Columbia, in which is the principles guiding me. First of all, I stand by my students. I support their right to express their views. I feel the same responsibility for the well-being of all Columbia students as I do for my patients as their doctor. Now, first of all, that pathologizes being a student, if you ask me. But my point is that there is a culture here of saying we are going to describe this all as about the wellness of the students and so forth and so on, which I don't think is actually what universities are supposed to be about. Now I've lost my place.
Lisa?
Yes. I should be finished.
Soon.
Okay, I can do that. I can do that. So in any event, this culture of trying to basically divert attention from some of the kinds of underlying questions at a university, that should we be about critical thinking or should we be about job readiness? Should we be trying to contain discussion and debate, or should we be fostering it? That kind of dissonance is inadequately addressed by this effort to say it's all about how you feel. It's actually not all about how you feel. And insofar as that's been sort of the diversionary tactic, it's clearly failed. So I do think that one of the challenges now is to return universities to their, sort of basic purpose, which is discovery, critical thinking, being subversive about the conventional wisdom. That's what we're supposed to be doing. That's very hard if you're worried about reputation management. So you have to decide whether reputation management, risk management, so forth and so on is your primary purpose, or whether the purpose is that we understood academic freedom to be supporting is your primary purpose.
Let me ask you very, very quickly, if we can, to tell us, based on your experience, what should be done. I mean, there is a major attack on knowledge, not just on universities. But there's also an attack on universities, on freedom of speech, slashing of budgets. First, they go for the scientists, although we are the enemy, right, in the social sciences and the humanities. But universities are more vulnerable when it comes to federal support, and it seems that we are witnessing, you correct me if I'm wrong, the dismantling of the government-academia nexus that was established in 1945 and its aftermath. So the question is, what can we do? We feel paralyzed, right? It's a bit like the Democratic Party. We don't know exactly what to do. So what should be done? How should we answer this challenge? Please.
One thing to do, and I don't mean to say this is simple, and I don't mean to say that I've got it all figured out, but one thing to do is to be more earnest and comprehensive in trying to explain to larger segments of the public what universities do contribute to society. And even though our leaders have tried to do that off and on for a long time, many of the books about universities that we all cite in our work are books largely directed at other academics. I don't think of very many works at the level of Clark Kerr's Uses of the University in 1963 that really tried to explain to a variety of constituencies why universities were good for the society as a whole. I know some people have tried to do that, but I think that is something that needs to be renewed and in a lot of different contexts. Part of that, I think, is that we need to stop hiding from the fact that educated people are an elite, and it's a good thing too. A difficulty we've had is that the Republicans have succeeded in making educated people a stigmatized category. I don't know how many columns Irving Christoph or Nicholas Christoph and David Brooks and David French and so forth can write about how educated elites are always patronizing all the rest of the society. I don't think there's that much of that. I don't think that that's nearly as large a problem. And it's to a large extent invented by critics of the university. So I believe that the attitudes publicly expressed by most academic intellectuals are not patronizing and not dismissive, but are at the same time affirmative of education for some of the reasons that we've talked about here. So I believe that our leadership has been, if anything, cowed by the claims that you guys are just a bunch of elitists and you don't care about the rest of society, but we do.
Any of you want to respond to this?
I actually, once again, I think we collectively can sort of sharpen our focus about what it is that we're supposed to be doing at a university. So I would argue again that highlighting the extent to which the academy is open to the unexpected and the surprising and startling and unsettling, is we should be saying that, yes, that's what we do, rather than actually we don't want anybody to be unsettled or startled or uncomfortable. No, that's what we do. So first of all, I think we should, return to a claim that yes, we're going to make people uncomfortable. That's what research is about. So that would be one thing. The other thing that I think is surprising, and this is not as true in Europe, that the American universities have failed to act collectively. So why that's so, except that everybody's competing over the best investment, endowment returns, I don't understand why this is something that Columbia is facing when we know this is a domino. Why is this not something that the elite universities are collectively? So that's a real puzzle to me. But clearly, there are university consortia in Europe that are about academic freedom and so forth and so on. American universities don't join that. We don't have our, so forth. So I do think that there's one, remembering what it is that we're supposed to be doing, and two, doing it together would be a help.
Do we have time for one or two questions?
Let Nick answer.
Oh, I'm sorry, Nick.
I'll just be let me be very quick, but I think my response is that, rather than say what we should do, and it builds on what Lisa was saying about a collective response, I think we should learn a little bit from what they did. This has been a long time coming. There's been a playbook for what's going on today. Places like the Goldwater Institute introduced 10 years ago legislation that has been adopted in some form or another in 23 of the 50 states, which effectively is a trailer for what's happening today. It insists on free speech on campus, and then it mandates how universities should discipline students. So the playbook has been there for a long time. And what we haven't, I think, learned, and it's partly this whole culture of competition and excellence and rankings and so on and so forth, but it's also partly, I think, a certain kind of naivete about politics, which is what we're all suffering from in a sense today, that we haven't.
Whatever happened to the political science department?
Well, but we haven't seen that. That's another panel. Okay.
Nelson is going to speak on that.
But just the point being that, Jane Mayer writes about this. I mean, for decades, there have been lots and lots of people working on what and how the universities have to be taken over. And I think we need to actually begin to invest those kinds of resources in that kind of project, which is probably a long-term one, but it has to be taken very, very seriously as a political project. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one or two questions. Comments?
Ask Ariel if she wants to ask.
Please. Ira. That would be quite something. Here you have a mic.
I just want to, the Columbia situation, that's the university I currently live in, is so pressing and dire that I want to speak just about, answer the question of what we should be doing in terms of the current immediate moment. I myself would like the leadership of my or any other university to do the following things. First, to articulate crisply and clearly what our red lines are. That is to say, we cannot franchise the governance of a university, public or private university, to political leadership in Washington, in Albany, in Sacramento, or wherever, and clarity about that, and with an explanation of why that is so, and how this country's values are at stake in establishing those lines. Second, and this is the point, Lisa, construct alliances. There is AAU. There are all kinds of organizations of research universities. There are even narrowly the so-called Ivy Plus universities. There are 13 of them. Why are none of these entities speaking in a collective voice? A collective voice that would explain the character of the red lines. Third, I'm perhaps speaking out of turn, but I'm stunned that my university had not prepared a high-end legal strategy knowing this was coming. In fact, when the administration says on a Monday, you will be investigated, and on a Friday, with no investigation of Title VI, punishes for Title VI violations, that could not stand in a court. I could think of 5 other reasons it shouldn't or couldn't stand. I'm not a lawyer, but I speak to lawyers. I think when the President of the United States said to the leader of Ukraine, "You have no cards," the only way for universities to get cards right now in the short run is a legal strategy. And those in Washington understand, they expect to be sued. But we have not done that, which then leaves us quite naked. Finally, I spent much of the last 2 days with colleagues in our health sciences world, which is bearing the burden of the $400 million. Labs closing, student programs shutting, patient care eviscerated in some places. And their instinct is to say, unless the leadership explains why we're resisting, perhaps we shouldn't resist. And we're in that very odd and awkward place. And enough from me about this, but I think if we did have these steps of alliances, law, and clarity about our principles, we would stand a much better chance in the world of democratic opinion than we do presently.
Yes, you want? Thank you, of course. The microphone is yours.
First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And thank you to the new school. I've been really very lucky in my work life. I don't think I could have done what I've done at the new school at any other university in this country, because they let me do what I want. They left me alone. And if I could raise the money, they let me do it. And I was able to do lots and lots of things with lots and lots of help. I can't begin to name the people who made all these things, like the editing of the journal, like the Journal Donation Project, Endangered Scholars, and most recently, the New University in Exile Consortium. These are group efforts. And I've been very lucky to have the most wonderful colleagues and people who work for me. 2 of them sitting here. I saw some of them others before, but it's been a real blessing and a real help, and I am grateful. And I do want to say about the moment we're in. I mean, as you know, the issue of the journal, which is been discussed here today, was initiated well before Trump became president. Trump became president and took a sledgehammer and is taking a sledgehammer to universities. And I'm moved by what Lisa said and the need for collective action. I think that is now the moment, as it was in the late 60s and early 70s, for all of us who care about universities to stand up and be heard, to protest, to organize, to go to Washington. If we are loud enough and there are enough of us, we will be heard. And I think that's now what we need to do. And I think that it could start with people like myself who are emeritus, people who have nothing to lose, presidents who are no longer presidents of universities. I think that's a way to begin, and there's very little at risk. We won't risk our jobs, we don't have any. So I urge you and ask you, and I see, just at the camera, Jamie? No, it's okay. I just ask you to join with us all in standing up now for what we care about and to defend academic freedom, which is being trashed. Thank you.